these are the main resources that I'm using, the main ones, not all of them, but the main ones. So Growl by Kim Stallwood. Now, I played a very, very small part in the BYV's radicalization in the early 80s, whereas Kim was a central player, a prime mover, as we say. Then also the Norm Phelps book, The Longest Struggle, and then Slaughter of the Innocent. Now, a general apology that I know that people watching this on the phone, they're going to struggle with seeing some of the slides. So apologies for that. There's not much I can do about it. What I will do for some of them is I'll go full screen, but that's not really going to help you too much. For one thing that you probably can't see is that little blurb at the bottom of the Hans Royce book, Slaughter of the Innocent, which came out in 1979. And it's by Spike Milligan, my kind of comic hero, if you like. A voice for the innocent of the animal world who, in the majority of cases, are dying painful deaths at the hands of a creature called Homo sapiens, who has time and time again proved he is not worth it. So there's a bit of Milligan for you, or Spike Maligna, the well-known typing error. Anti-vivisectionist Ray Greek, I've not used much from him actually, says that people began researching on humans, usually convicted prisoners and other animals, from around the third century before the Common Era, but many point to a century before that, and in particular to Claudius Galenus, who is more commonly known as Galen. Some say that the reason he used other animals is because he wasn't allowed to use humans. It was kind of against the law. And in fact, he became a physician in Rome, and he became the doctor to the gladiators. So that's an interesting one. I think that might actually be one way that he could have a lot of contact with humans to do that, on the grounds that he's not allowed to research on them. And he is also the physician to 5 emperors. So he was known as the father of vivisection in many kind of histories. But his work was strewn with errors precisely because he researched mainly on other animals. So he made a lot of anatomical mistakes. He thought that fruit was bad for humans, but he also thought that pus was good for us. So Royce is saying that Galen's teaching were disastrous for humanity. As I said, he made a lot of mistakes, but he was defended by the Catholic Church for a long, long time. And so that meant going against him was a dangerous thing to do. And so the mistakes that he made were, as it were, protected. Yeah, Michael, that's well, actually, funny enough, there are some websites that say that Galen was a genius, medical genius and this kind of stuff. So you do get different versions of that, but certainly in terms of his mistakes, he made a lot of them, and they kind of, as it were, because he was protected, lasted for a long time. Then, just to bring things up to date, or at least move things along very quickly, we've got René Descartes from the 1600s and Claude Bernard from the 1800s. And Bernard in particular is seen as the father of the scientific method that is still used, so seen as a major kind of player in this story. So now we move to where we're supposed to be, which is the opposition to vivisection. And that is said to date from Victorian Britain. So we talked about 1837 through to 1901. So really, this is where the story really starts, if you like, which is a throwback to Spike Milligan. He used to, about 20 minutes into the Goon shows, he used to have an announcement saying, "So, folks, this is where the story really starts," even though it was kind of more than halfway through. Norm Phelps said that nothing really happened until Francis Power Cobb exploded onto the scene in 1863. So that's Power Cobb to the right. Looks like a formidable person, not to mince with, I imagine. And of course, Cobb is famous for her feminist writings as well as her anti-vivisection work. Probably anti-slavery too. There's a lot lot of intertwining at this time in those issues. The one thing that she wasn't was a vegetarian. A lot of them were vegetarian. George Bernard Shaw. They kind of stood for against everything, if you like. Kim Stallwood said, in fact, that the abolitionist versus the reformist disputes flared up almost immediately in the anti-vivisection movement. I suppose Cobb was central to that. I mean, she actually left some groups, started others, precisely because they kind of moderated their opinion. She was Dublin County born, so she was born in Ireland, and she began the Victoria Street Society for the Protection of Animals from Vivisection, which is a pretty neat but very long name. This is 1875, and then the BUAV in 1898. And so that marks the difference. She actually moved from the one to the other because the Victoria Street Society kind of moderated and she wasn't having any of that. So she formed the BUAV. That included abolition in its name, kind of on purpose, the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection. It's now been changed to a weaker name, which is Cruelty Free International. And in fact, their history of their own group is a little bit confused. For example, they do mention that they were formed in 1898, but then they say that they changed their name to the BUAV in about 1947, I think it said. So there's a couple of mistakes there, I think. Also, the Little Brown Dog affair, that is part of this story, the vivisection story. But we're not going to go into it today because I've got a time tunnel all about that coming up. Interesting, Kim Stallwood talks about the old brown dog. He says that as the story of the old brown dog illustrates, the 2 decades immediately prior to World War I were a high point for agitation surrounding vegetarianism, anti-vivisectionism, and social progress. So we've got the formation of the anti-vivisection groups, as we said. As we move forward, Cobb is replaced by Dr. Walter Hadwin. Now, when I was getting involved, I knew the Hadwin Trust, Dr. Hadwin Trust. That was one of the 2 big kind of alternatives kind of group, along with the Dowding Fund for Medical Research. So it was the BUAV that started the Hadwin Trust in 1970. One thing I didn't know about Hadwin is that he was charged with manslaughter because a girl he was treating died of tonsillitis. I didn't know that. But in the subsequent trial, he was found not guilty. Kim Stallwood rightly comments that didn't do his reputation much good, though, in that sense. And also, he makes a comment about the fact that the anti-vivisection movement at this time had links to campaigns against vaccination and also for women's suffrage. So we could be going right back to Cobb there. Now, interestingly, Kim says both of which made the organization vulnerable to attacks from its enemies for being at once anti-science and secondly too radical. The BUAV had a publication called Animal Welfare. Kim says tellingly it was called Animal Welfare. In the 1950s, the BUAV is there. They had a first campaign against Porton Down. So we're gonna talk about Porton Down a little bit later. But that's a secret experiment place in Wiltshire. And it involved chemical and biological weapons. And as you'll see, it's very kind of James Bond and still there to this day. The BUAV also talked about the experimental other animals who were being sent into space at the time. So Kim also says that by the time we get to the 60s and 70s, things are slow in these days, as you can imagine, pre-internet and all that. The BUAV began to respond to the government's early interest, as he puts it, in revising the 1876 Cruelty to Animals Act, which is to the left. I appreciate that nobody can probably see that, let alone people on the phone. And they responded to that by handing in a petition of 300,000 people to Downing Street in order to support, calls for reform and modernization of this act that kind of nobody likes. So the Cruelty to Animals Act is the legislation that oversees vivisection. So it's replaced 100 years later by the 1986 Animals (Scientific Procedures) Act, we were very involved with that because I was very involved with the BOV at the time. It was a piece of legislation that it seemed to be something that the anti-vivisectionists would welcome because it was a chance to update and improve the existing legislation, but it was also seen ultimately as a vivisector's charter. That's what Animal Aid called it. And so all the anti-vivisectionists now say that it was a dreadful piece of legislation and a terrible kind of missed opportunity. Now, in this book, this is Peter Singer's In Defense of Animals. That's the first edition. Kim said that, and that was 1985, he says that the most abolitionists of all the anti-vivisection groups, in other words, the BOV, had by the 1980s become appallingly archaic and Dickensian. And then he kind of clarifies what he meant in his later book called Growl. And he says, by which I meant that although on paper the membership was around 4,000 individuals, it was hard to locate any active members. The head office didn't have any means, including leaflets, of promoting its ideas or the organization, which in turn meant that the BOV did very little, if any, campaigning. So that is certainly true. It was kind of moribund. It was kind of like dead in the water kind of thing. When the progressives moved into the BOV after taking it over, we're talking about very early 80s now, I just remember going in and seeing this kind of their stock cupboard. It's like a broom cupboard, a little kind of cubby hole kind of thing. And the only thing I remember was a few books written by the director of the organization. I think there was a few copies of this animal welfare journal. And then there was lots of tea towels depicting the North Yorkshire town of Harrogate. So I'm not actually quite sure why all that happened. So yeah, it's a bit of a mystery. The Harrogate tea towels have always been a mystery. I've never got to the bottom of that. Right, so we're up to the 1970s and 80s then. So this is the context of what led to the radicalization of the BOV. Progressives in the movement were casting their eyes on the RSPCA. Kim said that organization was dominated by people who supported hunting, and they saw the main aim of the RSPCA as essentially stopping cruelty to cats and dogs. So the progressives set about doing something about the RSPCA. It's really interesting. In the press, the progressives are always called the Young Turks versus the Old Guard. That's usually the way it's put together. There's quite a few people in the kind of RSPCA reform group that we would know, like Richard Ryder. There's also Richard Corse, Dick Corse, he was called. He was a main player in the League Against Cruel Sports and various other people. And so it was another one where you had this other kind of stagnant organization and also one that promoted animal use. But then again, it was the RSPCA. So yeah, it did. You know, there wasn't as much confusion about the RSPCA then than there is now. At the same time, it was still thought worthy of trying to improve it and actually get it to, at least stand up to its name within its own remit. See, they got people to join. I think somebody paid for me to join the RSPCA at this time. And so I remember going to an EGM or an AGM, and it was in this swanky hotel in London. And I do remember the morning session where we voted that the Queen would be thrown out of being the RSPCA patron on the ground that she went shooting and hunting. And that motion passed. And then we went for a lunch break to be told that the RSPCA Council had reinstated the Queen as patron in the lunch break. So nothing much changed. Again, Young Turks and Old Guard. So Stallwood was kind of involved with this RSPCA reform thing, and he thought, well, I wonder whether this strategy would work with the BOV as well. And so he was well placed at this time because a little earlier in 1978, he had, along with Faye Funnell, and Faye Funnell is the person who burnt the fur coat that I mentioned in the kind of intro to this new series. Faye Funnell and Angela Walder and Kim Stallwood, they co-founded the coordinating animal welfare group, which was called CORE. It was used as a kind of mobilization tool and a radicalization tool, if you like. Again, this is pre-internet, and so it was a networking idea. Now, Angela Walder later became the scientific advisor for the BOAV after it had been radicalized. I remember a time when she told me that because she was an animal technician at one point, and so she used to have the job of taking the other animals from the holding unit to the lab, and she said that the government inspectors wouldn't go into the animal house, and the reason for that is that they didn't want to get hairs on their suits. That's how good the the inspections were. Anyway, back to CORE. So CORE, coordinated animal welfare. Despite the name, it was central to what we call animal rights in those days. It was pretty active. It was this coordinating group, as I said. It did the first public screening for the Animals film, for example. So we talk about 1981/82. It oversaw the closure of Club Row, which was a notorious animal market. That's going to come up in a little while. Had presentations from some of the big names in the movement at the time, like Clive Hollands. Clive Hollands was the president, I think it was, of the, SSPV, the Scottish Society for the Prevention of Vivisection, one of the Scottish groups. Also, Richard Ryder gave talks, and philosopher Peter Singer as well. Did Tom Reagan talk, I hear you ask? I don't know. I don't think so. Also, at the CORE meetings, organizations would set up some stalls, which is to sell books and give out free information. And also, they would provide vegan-friendly food. And another thing they did was they coordinated the campaign to take over the BOAV, or win control of the BOAV, as Kim puts it. Kim, at this time, was already working for the BOAV. So this is a really weird thing, because he was essentially trying to take over or close down his own employers, right? And so they found out about it, and of course they weren't too happy, and said to Kim, well, look, if you chair another meeting of CORE, then you're out the door here, type of thing. And so for a couple of meetings, he sat outside the CORE meetings, just sat outside in the street. People would come out and tell him what was going on. And of course, the BOAV people found out about that as well and weren't too happy again, and eventually kind of let him go, as I think is the phrase that people use nowadays. So we're up to early 1980s, and indeed the Young Turks do take control of the BOAV's executive committee. I joined it in 1982. Kim Stallwood was rehired a year earlier, so we talk about January 1981, and became the BOAV's campaign officer. Let me bring this back in. And Kim said, our revolution at BOAV sent shockwaves throughout the British animal rights movement and beyond, including the United States and Australia. Now, that, in my assessment, that is really accurate. It's difficult to overplay the effect that what was going on at the time. This was kind of real peak in stuff, but the BOAV's radicalization was a major part of it. And one reason for that is that for the first time, relatively radical people had access to quite a lot of money. You know, Animal Aid had started in 1977, and they were doing a lot of locally based stuff, a lot of leafleting and this kind of stuff. They used to specialize in giving leaflets out at the tube stations in London, for example, but they also had local contacts. So there was a kind of lot going on. The HSA were very busy. The ALF was very busy. They had the Animal Liberation Leagues, the regional groups as well. So a lot started happening. And the BOAV's radicalization was a lot to do with it, because they ended up being a really big coordinating thing and publicized everything in their magazine, which they started to call the Liberator. And they changed it from Animal Welfare to the Liberator. And it was a big, glossy, quite horrible looking thing. And then they made it into like a tabloid. So I've got some shots of that coming up. Now, I don't know what happened to the Harrogate tea towels, but they were quickly replaced by posters and leaflets, including fly posters. Now, the fly posters from the BOAV were pretty graphic, so I'm not going to show you them I've actually got a couple of shots of them, but they're so small you can't really see them later. But I'm not going to show you them. I was a volunteer at the BYV at this time. It was just before I became a committee member, and the fly posters, we kind of sent them everywhere. So I remember being in the office and we bundled together lots of the leaflets, all these fly posters, and we sent them to just about anybody we could think of who might put them up, might do a little bit of fly posting. And in fact, that's what happened. We started to get lots and lots of photographs of these fly posters all over the country, and they ended up in the press. It caused a big stir, and then the BYV got into trouble. I remember that, because I think they put their name at the bottom of the fly posters, and maybe even their address, maybe even have the phone number. And so a lot of the local councils started to threaten to sue them for either advertising space or kind of criminal damage, because obviously fly posting is on empty buildings, that kind of thing. So I do remember they had to reprint all the posters and take their name off them, and then they all went back up again. So that was pretty good. Now, in terms of things going on nationally, the BYV became the main organizer for the World Day for Laboratory Animals, which is April the 24th. I'm a bit sketchy on the fine details of this, in the sense that I think the World Day might have existed before, and it might have initially been run by the National Anti-Vivisection Society, NAVS. But I think what Kim did, because he took over the organizing of it for 6 national demos, I think he either revitalized it or he might have actually come up with the idea. I'm not sure about that fine detail. Now, the first one that he organized was 1982, which drew a crowd of, well, people say between 5,000 and 6,000 people. And this involved walking 6 miles from a town in England called Salisbury through to Porton Down. These warfare experiments go. I'm going to make that full screen. You see, it's very James Bond, isn't it? You see that picture of the lab, Britain's secret nerve gas lab. Very Thunderball, I think. And so it's still there, and it's still doing all kinds of horrendous things, as far as I'm aware. So that was the second time, really, that the BYV had picked on Porton. So this is the Liberator, talking about the siege of Porton. And then the smaller pictures, they are from 1983, when some people returned to Porton Down, and they also stopped these trains, a bit of civil disobedience. The picture at the bottom, of course, is people, as it were, getting taken off the tracks. This is a shot of the storming of Porton grounds. There was a lot of talk about whether it was a good idea, in the sense that we talk about chemical and biological warfare experiments, but obviously you wouldn't get that far anyway. Now, the largest of the demos that Kim Stewart organized involved 9,000 people, and 600 of those took part in this kind of elaborate street theatre, which was pretty good. What happened was, every 6 seconds a bell chimed, marking when one of the laboratory animals was killed. And they had some people dressed up as vivisectors who kind of came and grabbed one person from the crowd, and kind of executed them on the spot and left them lying there. So at the end of the 90 minutes or so, there was 600 people kind of dead, as it were. So it was quite a effective stunt, if you like. And although you can't see it too well, that Liberator, that picture actually is about that particular thing. It says 600 people die in Trafalgar Square. So that's what that one's talking about. The person giving a talk there is Jeremy Corbyn, who became the Labour leader, of course, in political terms. What was I going to say? I was going to say something more about the... really, Kim was talking about the achievements of the BYV, and they're not kind of great in a way. It said, for example, that they ignored the protests about the update, and they came out with this vivisectors charter and everything. But he said that it did lead to other things later, down the line. He says, for example, the British government subsequently banned the testing of cosmetics on other animals in 1997, and the LD50 toxicity test in 2001. The LD50 test is a pretty gruesome thing. In 2003, European Union agreed to a membership-wide ban on cosmetic testing to happen 10 years later in 2013. So as you can see there, it, you know, you wouldn't put that down as massive kind of gains, but it's certainly, in terms of promoting what was going on, pretty good. So before we go into, as it were, the decline, I just want to go through a few slides showing some of the impact of what was going on in those days. So let's see what we've got. The merchandise for the new radicalized group were really good, and they were put together by a group called Animus. I used to go to Animus to get our badges and everything, because we started an animal rights shop in 1982. And we think it's the first animal rights shop in Britain at the time. So we used to get all the sales goods from all the big groups on sale or return, because we couldn't afford to actually get them in. And so we used to get this big range of t-shirts and sweatshirts and everything. There's badges there on the second row. The enameled badges, I think they were a hangover from the previous time. I think they must have found them in the office and everything. So then you got books. Is Tom Reagan's The Case for Animal Rights there, Roger? I hear you ask. No, it isn't. Animal Liberation by Peter Singer is, of course, and a couple of scientific anti-vivisection books as well. But then again, we are talking about 1984 here, but the case was out by then. Then you've got all the posters and leaflets, and you used to have to pay to get them in those days. But that's the way it went. Again, this is all pre-internet, so it was much more difficult to kind of pass things around in a way. They were very, very kind of powerful resources. This every 6 seconds is really the kind of trademark slogan of the BOAV, according to Kim Stallwood. And it was everywhere, including kind of train stations and stuff. They had those big posters that you see now with Go Vegan World. They're big posters about it. They also had leaflets. This actually is an advert which was published in newspapers. When I was on the committee, we used to get a rundown of all the, the advertising. Did we get any new members from this one? Did we get some new legacies, this kind of stuff? And they usually got put in the kind of more lefty kind of papers. It was usually a waste of time putting them in the kind of right-wing press. We used to get quite a lot of members through actual kind of proper advertising, if you like. And so we used to use that general slogan every 6 seconds. Now, again, for the people with phones, there's no way you're gonna see this, so I apologize for that. But this is a week of action. So this is the kind of galvanizing of the grassroots, which was part and parcel of the radicalization of the BOAV. So these are kind of a week of action, and these are all the photographs from all the stuff that's kind of going on around it. Oh yeah, well, I did want to say this is a shot from Scotland, and if you recall the posters and the badges and all that kind of stuff, it's actually very difficult to find posters and badges and everything which have got a lot of claims about cruelty back in those days. Like, for example, here, one of the main banners is "Animals Have Rights," right? And so that's kind of the main claims making at the time, if you like. And so you don't get the kind of same cruelty claims as you do in the modern movement. And I think it might be, and this is only me speculating, of course, it could be because at the time of the BOAV radicalization, it was a time when people were trying to do something about the RSPCA, but we knew full well what the RSPCA was, traditional animal welfare group. It wouldn't go near veganism with the barge pole. We know that. Whereas in the modern movement, I think there's some confusion about things like the RSPCA. And I think that's something to do with the prominence of the word cruelty in the modern movement, because they see prevention of cruelty to animals and think, veganism. Of course, it doesn't connect with the RSPCA. It's not to do with it. The Liberator to the right there, Horace Hazelton. So that was a group that I co-founded, the Hazelton Action Group. And we'll be talking about that in another time tunnel coming up. But this is just self-indulgence on my case. What we did was we broke in and retrieved quite a lot of paperwork about paraquat experiments that they were doing ended up in an anti-vivisection book, and on the front page of the Liberator and also the NAVS journals. I think Animal Aid covered it as well, so that was pretty good. And one of the first victories, I suppose, is Club Row Goes. So this is early '83 at this stage. So this notorious Victorian kind of market, kind of East End market, very kind of grubby place, did close down in the end. Problem with that, of course, is that it moved somewhere else. So this is, you know, often a problem, a long-standing campaign, and then the target, as it were, moves elsewhere. Yeah, this is a bit of an attack on Charles River, another animal breeding place. Charles River used to, I don't know whether they do, but they used to own islands where they bred primates for research. I don't know whether they still do. And then this was the London Underground, and as you can see, it's another one of the BYV big posters. Curiosity will kill this cat, but they also had the every 6 seconds one on there as well. And the guy in the picture is Mick Heslin, who was a kind of graphic designer for them, still active on Facebook, and he also accompanied me, or I accompanied him on the Orkney trip in terms of the Sea Shepherd. So that's going to be another time tunnel as well. Just a couple more Liberators, and again, if you want to actually read these, go to Talon Conspiracy, and you can find the full thing, and you can actually leaf through each and every one. Another March 8,000 this time. And then the BYV prosecutes surgeons. Now, I don't know whether you can see that, probably not, but the vivisectors had tattooed the word crap on the monkey's forehead. So that's what vivisectors are like, folks. Okay, now, so the decline, really, let's just drop this out for a second. So the decline of the BYV, there was a lot of push to put animals into politics at one time. Now, Kim Stoll is really big on that. I tend not to go for it. I think we need cultural change first. There was something called GCAP and putting animals into politics. GCAP now, what was that? General Election Coordinating Committee for Animal Protection, I think it was. They did a series of kind of general elections in Britain, and what they did was they would contact all the parties, first of all, try and get them to do something about animal welfare in their manifestos, and then kind of when that was done, they would then recommend to their membership who to vote for, essentially. So some of the activists weren't too pleased about that on the grounds that they thought that, you know, action and campaigning was kind of more important than messing with the politicians. I mean, they'd also seen the start of the kind of campaign and lobbying that led to the hunting ban. So you ended up with the League Against Cruel Sports kind of taking MPs out for steak dinners and stuff. So it's very difficult from a kind of a vegan point of view. But of course, veganism wasn't the moral baseline of the movement at this time. Boots was an issue. When Ronnie and I were in prison, we got news that Boots, I think, had sued the BYV, and I think they were ordered to pay £30,000 to Boots the vivisectors. I think they agreed to do it, and we were opposed to it. We said, well, look, just close the BYV down. You know, it's just a name, it's just a group, and then once you've done that, just start it again with it. You know, but they wouldn't do that. Then they changed a few things. For example, one of their taglines was against all animal experiments to reflect their abolitionist thing. And then that was changed to against animal experiments. So took the all bit out. And then they changed the name in full to Cruelty Free International. Vivisection kind of, I mean, it still bubbled under really, but it kind of disappeared as, you know, as veganism became the main thing that everybody started doing, then vivisection got kind of pushed a little bit. But as I gave you a hint before, we do have Camp Beagle now, and so that is very active at the moment. I think there's been a couple of splits in that movement, but don't need to go into that. But there is a thing about focus on beagles or focus on dogs, or, you know, one species at a time. These kind of ideas, which might not go well. And again, we've then got the kind of cranky vegan issue of it doesn't matter if people are not vegan, right? And so there's quite a lot of people at Camp Vegan beagle who are not vegan. So that can be an issue within the modern movement, which wasn't the case back in the 80s, for example. This is one of the days of action when they were trying to block the beagles coming out. As you can see, lots of yellow, that's all the police officers. And this is a good sign here. Police and MBR Acres, that's where Camp Beagle is, escort puppies for torture. A special shout out perhaps for Speak and for Mel Broughton. Mel is still in prison, as far as I know. They have kept things going, really, in terms of vivisection, but sometimes fairly low key. If you look at their Facebook page, they complain that, you know, oh, it's 4 days after the World Day for Laboratory Animals and now we can only get 6 people out, you know, that type of thing. But the World Day for Laboratory Animals still goes on, but instead of thousands of people, you're now getting kind of hundreds. And then before I came on the air, I said to Ronnie, what's going on apart from Camp Beagle and Speak? And he said, there's a National Day of Action against the British Heart Foundation. And he says there's also regular weekly protests against Sequani Animal Research Lab in Ledbury. So there are some things that are still kind of bubbling under in terms of vivisection. Whether it will ever get back to the glory days, as it were, of the 80s, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure whether the focus should go back off veganism. I think that that would probably be a mistake. Okay, everyone, and Bernie, I think your ears are going to be fine for the outro. So bye for now, everyone.